Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for our presentation, Race, Class, and Reading, Disrupting the Pedagogy of Low Expectations. I'm Alicia Smith, and I'm the president of the International Dyslexia Association.
Hello, everybody.
Ontario
Thank you
branch.
for joining us tonight for our presentation.
And I'm having a technical difficulty. Sorry about that. I'm joined here tonight by Joanne Bertrand, who is the vice president of IDA Ontario. Joanne will be in the background for the presentation this evening in the chat. So if you have any comments or questions, please put those in the chat or use the Q&A feature. At the end of the discussion, we will have the opportunity to take some of your questions and ask them directly to the panelists, and Joanne will take care of that for us. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists for this evening. Our first panelist is Cheryl Urbanczyk, and I'm going to invite Cheryl to say hello and introduce herself to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It's an exciting conversation. My name is Cheryl Urbanczyk. I've been in education for over 25 years in a variety of capacities, from teaching to administration in private and public schools in the US and Canada. Currently, I'm a vice principal in one of the public school boards in the GTHA. I'm also a dyslexic parent, and I got to study Orton Gillingham in order to help my daughter. And it works so wonderfully that I've just stayed with Orton Gillingham. I'm now a fellow in training with the OGA and a structured literacy dyslexia specialist. And through my platform, Learn Literacy, I support parents, tutor students, train teachers, and advocate for literacy as a human right. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Our next speaker is Risha Conroy. Risha, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Good evening. Thank you for having me and inviting me to be part of this panel. My name is Risha Conroy, and I am the founder of the Dyslexia Alliance for Black Children. We are based in New York, but we work with families across the United States. I am the parent of two children with language-based learning disabilities, one who also has dyslexia. My background is in education reform, and I'm a speech language pathologist. But what really brings me to this space is my experience as a mother and the obstacles and the barriers that we faced when we were trying to get not just a diagnosis, but also intervention, and really understanding that, my story was not unique to me, and there was a need for support for families and for advocacy.
Thank you, Risha. Our next panel guest is Amuna Baraka-Clark. Amuna, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Good evening. My name is Amuna Baraka-Clark, and I'm very excited to participate in this panel tonight. I'm part of a panel that I can see that there's a wealth of knowledge already. Learning from everyone will be an exciting portion of this evening for me. I come to this panel also as a parent. My daughter's now 17. And received a diagnosis of dyslexia probably somewhere in elementary school. And so just wanting to have the opportunity tonight to speak a little bit about what some of our challenges are, and also what some of the things, some of the inequities that we realized along the way that we're hoping will soon be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our next panel guest is Kamisha Cox.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here this evening to share and learn with you all. My name is Kamisha Cox. I'm the founding director of the Reading Partnership, a passion project I've had the pleasure of working on for the past 10 years with a mission to literacy-focused programs and resources that empower children and their families, and with a vision to see every child in every community receive the early support they need to learn to write and read so that they can reach their full potential and succeed in school and work and in life. At the Reading Partnership, we deliver 3 evidence-based programs: the Reading Partnership for Parents, teaching parents how to teach their children ages 4 to 6 to read; the 360 Stories program, which gives kids the 360 experience of bringing a book to life, from writing to editing to illustrating to publishing and presenting it, and Kids Read TO, a virtual book club that brings together kids from different communities through good books and weekly virtual book club meetings. And so, we've reached over 10,000 people during this decade of work, and are really looking forward to the partnerships that people will encounter in the next chapter. I'm an Ontario certified teacher, but have really dedicated the past 10 years of my career to the Reading Partnership and the work that we do in communities.
Thanks, Kamisha. And our final panel guest is Anthony Edwards. Anthony, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for having me and inviting me to this panel this evening. I am a recently retired superintendent of education. I worked for the second largest public school board in the province of Ontario. I was secondary school training, but I really didn't even become aware of the challenges until my first son was born, who has challenged by dyslexia, and I quickly had to learn a lot about dyslexia and how to serve students properly. And it opened a can of worms for me as within the profession. So I myself am in training as an OG associate, and I'm looking forward to sharing views with everyone here today.
Thanks so much. So I am just going to share my screen again, and I'm going to lay out a little bit of background information so that we can set the stage for our discussion today. So again, the title of the workshop is Race, Class, and Reading, Disrupting the Pedagogy of Low Expectations. So I just wanted to start off by really diving into that word pedagogy. What do we mean by that? So I found this definition of pedagogy, which I quite like: the study of teaching methods, including the aims of education and the ways in which such goals may be achieved. So this I like because it talks really to the what are we trying to achieve and how are we trying to achieve it. So when it comes to teaching children to read in Ontario, what is the goal? What are we trying to achieve? So in 2004, the Ontario Ministry of Education put out a specific goal, and that goal was that we would have 75% of students meeting the reading and writing expectations set out by the province on our EQAO reading assessment and writing assessment. As far as I know, that goal has not changed since 2004. That has been the stated goal. So how are we trying to reach the goal? So to really understand this, I think it's important to reflect back on the ideas that we have about reading development. And a lot of those here in Ontario and in many other places in the English-speaking world really date back to the beliefs that were popularized in the whole language movement of the 1960s and 70s. So there were a number of prominent scholars in this movement. Two very influential scholars were Frank Smith and Ken Goodman. Frank Smith actually worked at the University of Toronto in the 1970s for quite a long time, and he completed the rest of his career here in Canada. So he was particularly influential in Canada. And he really believed and taught that reading is a natural process that develops for children if they are immersed in a literacy-rich environment with very little need for explicit instruction, as is evident in this quote. Knowledge of reading is developed through the practice of reading, not through anything that's taught at school. Ken Goodman was another prominent whole language scholar. He very much agreed with Frank Smith's ideas about reading being a natural process. And he also put out a very influential theory about how we actually read words. So this came out of a paper that he published in 1967 called Reading, a Psycholinguistic Guessing Game, where he theorized that readers utilize not one, but three kinds of information simultaneously. He predicts and anticipates on the basis of this information, sampling from the print just enough to confirm his guess of what's coming. So this means that the idea is that people don't need to actually look at all of the letters in a word to identify what that word is. There are lots of other sources of information that a reader could rely upon. And this theory has become known as the 3 cueing theory of word reading, which is very common in education, as you'll see next, because we're going to look at our curricular documents. So the influence of Smith and Goodman, we can still see this in our policies around reading instruction, as well as in the provincial curriculum, which of course guides teacher training. It guides all of the aspects of how we're trying to achieve the goal. So when you look at the Ontario language curriculum, or the kindergarten program specifically starts, we have a really big focus on immersion in a literacy-rich environment. So it's a lot about making sure that kids have those rich experiences in play to develop their oral language. And I want to say that that is really, really important. We absolutely have to do that. Children need to be exposed to stories in lots of different contexts. They need to have lots of opportunities to engage in discussion and play. That is the foundation for reading. So we're doing a good job on that, and we need to continue. That's really important. But I'd also like to point out that within the kindergarten curriculum, there's no mention at all of any sort of explicit instruction in the foundational skills that children will need to have in place so that they can learn to read and write. So that includes things like how to hold a pencil, how to form letters, top to bottom, how to form them correctly. There's no mention of any sort of systematic instruction in letter sound correspondence, so that the children will learn the sounds that the letters represent so that they can sound out words, or any sort of explicit instruction or practice in how to segment a word, like pull it apart so that you can spell it. And that's not to say that there aren't kindergarten teachers in Ontario who are doing these things and are doing a very good job. I know actually tons of them that attend our IDA Ontario workshops that are doing this. It's just to say that that is not a part of the kindergarten curriculum. So the instruction that's happening in kindergarten classrooms across Ontario is highly inconsistent. In some places, there's a lot of that, and in other places, it's entirely play-based. When we go past kindergarten and we start looking at the curriculum for grades 1 to grade 8, starting in grade 1, the expectations in the curriculum focus on the types of reading and writing activities that the students will engage in. So they look like, students will participate in writing poetry, they will do informational writing, they'll read for a variety of purposes. And again, this is really important. We want kids to be engaging in lots and lots of different types of literacy activities. We want them to be exposed to all sorts of different kinds of text that they find relevant and meaningful. This is good. However, there's really very little in the curriculum that explains how students are going to get there. So there's not a lot of guidance for teachers related to actually teaching the foundational skills that they would need to decode words or spelling. There's not a lot there. We can also see the influence of Goodman in the part of the curriculum that talks about how children are going to learn to actually read words. So we see this is a screenshot from the curriculum that it specifies that 3 cueing instruction is how children are going to learn to read words. This means that the reading programs that are being used in most Ontario elementary schools are based around systems of leveled books. So these are like the PM books or the Fontes and Pinnell classroom series. These are books that are designed specifically to be used with that 3 cueing instruction. So they're often highly predictable, and there's lots of support from pictures. And those supports are sort of taken away as the children progress through the levels. They're often numbered leveling systems. The student progress as they're working through learning to read is often tracked using assessment tools that are designed specifically to be used with those systems of leveled books. So those are called benchmark assessments. If parents here probably might have heard from a teacher, my child is reading at a level 6 or something like that. That is tracking how they're going through those systems of leveled books. When there are students who are not progressing through those systems of leveled books, they're often placed on IEPs, individualized education plans, and the expectations for that student are modified. So if the expectation is that by the end of grade 2, students would be reading at a level 20 in that system of books, a child with an IEP might have a very different goal. It might be reduced, and we might say, it would be great if we could get this child to a level 5 by the end of the year. And when it comes to intervention, what we're doing for intervention, we're typically in Ontario taking the wait and see approach. So what we do, the sort of prevailing logic here, is that children develop at different rates. And so we should give them time to see if they will catch up on their own before we step in and offer any additional instruction to that child. So typically we know that intervention in Ontario, if it's happening in school at all, isn't usually happening until kids are in grade 3 or later. So now I want to open it up and bring it back to my panel guests and ask you our first question of the evening. And I'll ask everybody that's participating and watching the webinar as well, you're welcome to put your thoughts about this question in the chat. So what problems, if any, do you see with our current pedagogy? And by that, of course, I mean the goal and also how we're trying to reach the goal. And so I'm going to start, I'm going to call on my panel guests one at a time. And maybe we'll go in reverse order from the introduction, and we'll start with Anthony.
Well, thank you. This is the million-dollar question. And I liken the analogy that we're asking kids to fly a plane before we actually teach them what the parts of the plane are, what to look for in terms of weather systems, how to land a plane. None of the components are taught, and therefore kids are just expected to get into the cockpit and fly this plane. Now, where I'm coming from is that we do not systematically or explicitly teach kids anything about phonemic awareness, what individual sounds look like, phonics, what that grapheme to phoneme relationship looks like, fluency, things about tempo and accuracy, vocabulary and comprehension. If we don't give kids these tools, access to these tools, and let them understand how language is developed, it's impossible to expect the majority of kids to become fluent readers.
I think that's such a good point. It's like we're asking them to fly a plane before we've actually even explained what the parts of the plane are, right? Reading is an incredibly complex thing. English especially is an incredibly complex language. And we really are kind of expecting kids to unpack it on their own. Kamisha, would you like to weigh in on this one?
Absolutely. I think that, here in Ontario, the Ministry of Education and school boards have been so, closely tied to the whole language approach for instruction for so long, and to the detriment of so many children. I'd say, like, in the early days of the Reading Partnership for Parents program, it was very difficult to secure partnerships with schools to deliver programs during the school day because of the program's focus on phonics. We were actually given this feedback when our application for partnership was denied. And the only way that we've been able to work in schools is through after-school initiatives. But we know that letter sound recognition is a strong indicator for reading success, and that phonics provides children with a tool to problem solve when reading. It's not the only tool children need in their tool belt, but it certainly is an important one. And I'd also say that I left Teachers College not knowing how to teach children to read. I developed those skills through my own interest and professional development. And I would go as far as to say that many teachers and ECEs leave training colleges across Canada without adequate knowledge and understanding of early literacy, and don't really know how to develop programs in their classrooms that develop foundational skills for reading and writing. I'd also say that we have a problem accessing diverse books, learning tools, and resources. Because when searching for books to integrate into our Reading Partnership for Parents program, it was nearly impossible to find books that reflected the diversity of the children and families we work with. And we ended up having to create our own series of books because kids need to see themselves reflected in the books they read and the books that are used to teach them to read. So, those are some of the issues that I'd say I see.
Thanks, Kamisha. That's so true. And I will say, I've had a brief look at Kamisha's books, and they're absolutely beautiful. You've done a really wonderful job with those resources. And I know that Kamisha would love to get those into communities across Ontario. So if you're interested in her and seeing what she's created, definitely visit the Reading Partnership, because they're lovely. Amuna, what would you like to weigh in on with this question?
I'd like to say that I'm really enjoying the chat. There's lots of really good comments coming out there. I've worked in the not-for-profit sector my entire career, so I don't have any professional background in education. However, as a parent going into the system, it resonated for me, Alicia, when you shared that information about whole language reading. That's how I learned to read. Reading it just came for me very easily. And I think that within the school system, it's sort of this one idea of how things happen. And I think this is, all of the talks that we're having now about equity and diverse needs. The school isn't constructed in a way to deal with students who learn differently. And so for my daughter going in, she had an IEP. They certainly, waited to see what was happening, even though I had identified early that something was off. They just said, all children develop at different levels. So let's just see how it goes. And finally, I spent a lot of money to have an assessment done, handed it over to the school. She received an IEP, but there was no action around that. So what they did was they reduced the goal. I think even at the end of grade 8, they said, she's learning at a grade 4 level, but nothing was done to help bring her up to a grade 8 level or to help her to read. Like, it was clear that the teachers did not, I think as Kamisha was saying, they didn't know how to do that. And so instead they just said, it's okay. You don't have to perform. You don't have to go to college. Lots of people leave high school and just go into the workforce. So I think some of what resonated for me is that the wait and see approach certainly doesn't work. And once they do see what's happening, at least for my child, it doesn't mean that there's any action tied to it to help children who have dyslexia or who have difficulty engaging with materials.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so true. And I hear that story really often speaking to parents. We speak to parents a lot when their kids are sort of in that transition from high school to university, or sorry, from grade 8 to high school phase is when often those modifications that were put in place when the child was in grade 2 or grade 3 really come to roost, because they realize that when the child is now transitioning into high school, that they're not going to be excluded from the pathways that lead to college and university. They're going to be streamed into the locally developed programs because those reading levels have been modified for so long that they aren't able to participate in those programs, which is really, it's horrible when you have those conversations with people and you realize the scale of that going on. We looked into that quite a bit in the recent report that we put out in the fall, lifting the curtain on EQAO scores. If you look in that report, the section that we have around the grade 10 OSSLT data speaks to the data, the prevalence of that experience happening. And I estimate it's grown quite a lot. It's about double over the last 15 years, the number of kids that are now getting to that transition point and being streamed into the locally developed courses. And Risha, I'd like to invite you to weigh in on this discussion.
Thank you. I'm also enjoying the conversation and looking at the chat as well. I think, before we even talk about pedagogy, we have to think about like what our beliefs are when we, enter a school building. And, if you're a teacher, an educator, a parent, it has to begin with the belief that children can be taught to read, right? And in fact, I think the numbers are, it's a very small percentage of children who cannot be taught to read. And we're talking about there being some other very severe deficits that might be present. So if your belief is that most children can be taught to read, any result that falls short of that should make you question your methods. And so like with any practice, and I think this applies to the teaching practice as well, it has to be reflective, right? So if you're reflecting on your practice and you see that, you see these low levels of reading proficiency, then you should be able to pivot, right? So what is it, because we're at a point where we could pivot. And what that means is that we have to look at what works. And there is so much information available about how we learn to read. We've reached the point where we can actually, have an MRI done and see, the impact of intervention of structured literacy on the brain, and how someone who has received intervention, if you look at their brain 10 years later, it's the areas that are activated are different. So we need to rely on what we know. We need to look at the evidence. We need to look at the research and then apply it in the classroom. Because it's out there. But what we see in the classroom, and what I saw as a parent, was this sort of hodgepodge of instructional approaches. So maybe there was a little bit of phonics, but there was definitely a lot of cueing and a lot of guessing. And as a parent, you trust that the school knows what they're doing, right? So it shouldn't be your first instinct to question the school. You'd send your child to school and it seems really basic that, yeah, my child is going to be taught to read. And they're not, because the methods that are being used are not working for most children. And in fact, we know that I think it's 60% of children require structured literacy in order to learn to read. And so if we are denying that to students, then we are creating inequity.
Thank you so much for mentioning that. I think that's so important. And we're definitely going to talk about that evidence-based instruction a little bit later on, but I'm glad you brought that in now. And also the notion that we should start with the belief that every child can learn to read. We have to start with that as the goal. That 75% is really a goal of failing 25%, right? Not meeting their needs. And Cheryl, I'd like to get you in on this conversation.
Great, thank you. I think in my response, I'll focus on the concept of like a print-rich environment. And I think sometimes what I see is that there's an over-reliance on that print-rich environment kind of magically doing the teaching. And it raises a couple questions of, well, if the environment is to do the teaching and the student is not learning, where is the accountability there? And then, it means the onus is on the child to kind of teach themselves from this environment. And that's not where the onus should be placed. The teacher is there to teach and instruct and provide clear, explicit, evidence-based instruction on how to read. And with specific thought to the topic of our conversation today, students who come in with different intersectionalities and marginalized identities are, further challenged in supporting themselves to take advantage of this literacy-rich environment in which they may not see themselves reflected, which then creates another barrier to accessing learning and reading and so forth. And so, we can use, we need a print-rich environment for many reasons. It's not the main instructor of literacy. And so if we move our thought processes to how can we teach clearly and explicitly, and yes, we need a library and books and all that stuff, we're removing an onus from the child to just avail of that print-rich environment to teach themselves to read.
Thanks, Cheryl. I think that's so important. And I saw someone mention in the chat as well, like, we need both of these things. We need to have the print-rich environment. We need to have culturally relevant and responsive text, but we also need to have evidence-based instruction and teach the kids to read. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to get on to the next question for our panel. So actually, quickly take a look at the science. And this works really well actually with what Risha was saying about what we know, the evidence around learning to read. So as Risha was saying, there's a very small percentage of children who really will have difficulty learning to read. We know that over 95% of all people can learn to read well. And I'd like to say here as well that we shouldn't write off the other 5% by any stretch of the imagination. We know that there are people that do have cognitive or language impairments that are going to limit their ability to read at grade level, but that doesn't mean that they can't learn to read at all. There's plenty of evidence to show that, like an individual who's in grade 12 and has an intellectual disability and is functioning at the level of like a grade 3 student, if they have the language skills of a grade 3 student, they should be able to read as well as a grade 3 student, provided that they receive appropriate instruction over a long enough period of time. So we should not give up on the other 5%, but we should at least be reaching 95% of people reading at grade level. But the experience of learning to read is not the same for everyone. Very much like Amuna said, some people do learn to read very easily, like the whole language people theorized. About 30% of people, maybe as many as 40% of people, learn to read very easily. They don't need much explicit instruction at all. However, the other 70% of people, their reading outcomes really depend on the access to instruction. But again, the experience is not the same for everyone. Some people need just a little bit of explicit instruction to get them going with reading, and then they're off and running. Whereas other people need quite a lot of explicit instruction or they're not going to be successful. And of course, students with dyslexia require quite a lot of explicit, systematic instruction delivered over a period of years to be successful with reading. But of course, we know they can be successful with reading. Most people can be successful with reading if they receive that instruction. So my next question for our panel guests is about the barriers that are preventing students from receiving the instruction that they need to be successful with literacy. And so I'm going to turn it back over to them again. Let me stop the share so we can see their beautiful faces. And I'll bring it back to you, Anthony.
Thank you. And so given my experience as a secondary school teacher, a lot of this was very foreign to me until my son came along and struggled with reading. It was very evident to me. And what I've come to realize in trying to help him and then trying to understand what the system does, and I think my responses will reflect sort of system thinking at that level, we are really challenged, at least in the province of Ontario, if the Ministry of Education cannot or will not accept some responsibility for the practices that the teachers are taking. This is not the fault of teachers in schools at all. And we have to acknowledge that. Teachers are doing what they were taught to do, thinking that they were doing the right things. So this has to begin with the ministry understanding that they are setting up the barriers by setting up practices that don't work. And by that, we have to re-examine pre-service teaching programs. I was not taught how to teach kids how to read as a teacher. It's shocking because when you think you're going to be teaching, you're going to help kids. You think you've learned a lot, and when it comes down to seeing a child struggle to read it, and I'm thinking, I don't know what to do to help my own son read. What do I do? It was not my experience. I was one of the lucky 30% that could read. So it's hard for us to understand that teachers have not been taught anything around the science of reading in their pre-service training. The other thing that teachers haven't been taught to do well is diagnostic testing so that they can intervene. And the challenge I learned through my son's experience is that special education programs, as well-meaning as they are really only developed to accommodate students or modify their program. very rarely do you actually see true interventions. And so the barrier becomes when we don't believe we can intervene, and when teachers are not given the tools to intervene, nothing can be done for these kids that's effective. So there are challenges that we have to face. These are not the problems of teachers. It's not the doing of teachers. It's what teachers are doing, what they've been taught and what they've been asked to do. One simple task. If I was shocked that my child was not being taught how to print in kindergarten, how can any child understand what the formation of a word looks like if they haven't been taught how to form letters? Again, they're just expected to somehow know how to print. It gives you some insight into the challenges that then cascade from there when it comes to reading and writing. So, and I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Anthony. That's you raised so many good points there, and I completely agree with you on it is not teachers' fault. None of this is the fault of teachers. They have been working so hard, doing the best that they can with the knowledge that they have, with the curriculum they've been provided, with the resources that they've been provided in their classrooms. And I know that they all want the best for their students. We have run a number of workshop series for teachers where we've had lots of engagement from teachers, and every single one of them has said in some way, shape, or form, I wish that I had this information sooner as they're starting to learn. And your other point that you didn't learn this in university, again, we ran a workshop series over the fall where we had over 900 teachers from across Ontario participate, from 55 different school boards and First Nations educational authorities. And we surveyed all of them, and only 8 learned anything about the science of reading or effective instruction in their university teacher preparation programs. So it is definitely a big, big issue. Kamisha, I want to give you a chance to jump in here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd say that, I think that there are organizations across the country doing awesome work to promote and improve literacy in community. Organizations delivering evidence-based programs with a track record of success and proven outcomes, and offering solutions that school boards should be looking to adopt and at the very least, learn from. But there seems to be an aversion by school boards to actually value education-based solutions coming from community. So they'll value the after-school cooking or basketball club, program, but they want to be positioned as the only expert on approaches to teaching and learning. And I think that in itself is a barrier to student success. Is school boards need to be more open to partnering with community and to looking to community for solutions to some of the challenges that we're seeing in schools.
Thanks, Kamisha. That is a really good point. Like, those partnerships in communities are so important, and getting the families involved. The way that the reading partnership really is very successful at that is because you're working with the whole family, which is fantastic. And Amuna, would you like to weigh in?
I have the question again. My mind is just running to a million different types of barriers, and I'm just trying to decide which one I want to hone in on.
Oh, the question was just about the barriers that are preventing students from accessing the instruction that they're at school.
Yeah, so I guess given the topic that we're speaking about tonight, I think I just have to talk about systemic discrimination and just racism. Again, like, my daughter will share with me that in her IEP classes, most of the children were racialized. Most of them were Black, actually. And she was one of the few students who was able to get into a regional program. They take 8 students in all of Peel. in that program, there were 2 Black students. The other 6 children were white. And it's interesting to me when you sort of look at the metrics of that, if the majority of the children in the IEP programs in the other levels were Black, what's happening in between like that and the opportunity to access a program that now has my daughter on the honor roll? So I think that, you know, in terms of identification, in terms of resources, in terms of expectations, many things happen along the way that has school officials not providing information and resources to children in the way that they should be, or to their parents. In our case, we paid a lot of money to have assessments happen. And it was through the assessments that we were able to learn even about the regional program that existed. So I think when you think about how discrimination happens within the school system, how racism is a force within the world generally, you know, we were in a position where I could take time off work. We had the money to be able to pay for the assessment. We had the money to pay for an OG tutor. There were all these other things that we were able to put in place that people who are low income, people who come from racialized communities, just sort of assume whatever it is that they're hearing that the school says, because we trust the school system, and believe that, you know, maybe our children are poorly behaved because that's what we're hearing, or maybe they just can't learn without having an opportunity to delve in. So I think that's something that's really important for us to identify here, that it's not by chance that many of our children, Black children, face these barriers to learning to read and to accessing resources that will make all the difference. We're not all Richard Branson, right? So many of us just won't have access to those tools, and they're not being made available to us because of how our lives are constructed and because of the energy that the student puts into helping or not helping our children.
There's so many good points that you just raised there, like from the allocation of resources within a school board, you know, where are those regional programs being located? Who's provided access to those regional programs? The necessity to get a formal identification to get into those programs. That's actually going to be our next question, but we'll get to that soon. And also, of course, you know, access to support outside of the school system. That is where a lot of people are going to get that instruction. When it's not available at school, people are turning to private tutors. So obviously, if you don't have the resources to access through instruction through a private tutor, and you're not getting it at school, that's a barrier right there. So you raised so many good points. Thank you for that. And Risha, I want to give you a chance to respond to this one as well. What are the barriers that you see?
Yeah, this is a good one. And like Amuna, it's like, what barrier do you focus on? So I am going to also speak about my experience as a Black parent. And I'm going to start with the question that I think, you know, when you walk into a lot of the dyslexia spaces comes to mind. Where are the Black people? Do Black people have dyslexia? And here in the States, dyslexia is a diagnosis of privilege, right? So if you are in a traditional sort of public school system, many school systems don't even use the word dyslexia. So you're not going to get that diagnosis if you are just relying on your school system to give it to you, which means that you have to rely on some sort of private outside evaluation to get that diagnosis. The other part of that is that, you know, in the definition of dyslexia, it says that there needs to be unexpected difficulties with reading. Very often in the classroom, and we have decades of research about bias when it comes to Black and brown children in the classroom. The expectations are low, and so if your expectations are low and you see a Black child in a classroom struggling with reading, you are not going to think that it's dyslexia, right? You're going to say, oh well, they just can't learn to read. And so to get a diagnosis of dyslexia, you first have to have high expectations for the child. And that is absent across so many schools when it comes to Black and Brown children. And in fact, you see that they do end up in special education, but not for the reason that they need to be there, right? Not for the primary reason. A lot of times, the primary reason that they might need to be there is because they have a language-based, reading disorder. But if it goes undiagnosed and you're a fifth grader, third grader, if we get to middle school, it's going to start to look like something else. It's going to start to look like a behavioral issue. And while you may not get that dyslexia diagnosis in the public school system, if you're a Black child, you absolutely will get the behavioral diagnosis. And in New York City, Black children are 2 times more likely to have an emotional disturbance diagnosis than their white peers. And so that is a significant barrier when it comes to Black children.
Thank you, Risha. That is such an important thing to keep in mind. And we don't have as much data around outcomes for racialized students in Ontario, but there's some really good research coming out of York University that speaks to that exact phenomena. Like, where are the Black and Brown children being identified within special education? And for sure, that research is showing that there are less Black and Brown children in Ontario that are getting official learning disabilities diagnoses. And there's an overrepresentation in the behavioral IEP category, which is wrong. That's just plain wrong. So Cheryl, I'd like to have you weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, I'll follow up in a similar concept to what Risha was speaking about. Like, I've been in this dyslexia field for over 10 years now, and it's the same thing when I go to different places and conferences and whatnot. I'm pretty much the only one who looks like me. And, part of the barrier is the conception that this affects everybody from all walks of life, but it's not treated equally amongst everyone from all walks of life. And so I don't think anyone has spoken yet about our multi-language learners or ELL students. And, there's many barriers for those children because the excuse is often made, well, they're an ELL student. It doesn't matter if they were born in this country, have been in school for, 10 years and they're now in grade 5 and really struggling. It's just, well, they're an ELL student. And, there's no kind of thinking beyond in terms of appropriate expectations. Yes, they can learn. Let's think of potentially other reasons for that, reading challenges affect all sectors of people, not just those who can afford to get support or those who may look like the dominant group in our area, but everyone. And we should really be on the lookout for those students. And, keeping in mind even the barriers for marginalized families to advocate appropriately, or ELL families to advocate appropriately, maybe when they do not speak English or are afraid of entering a school and speaking to people in positions of power in that school system.
That's such a good point, Cheryl. Like, there's a lot of points that you made there that are really good points. And we're going to talk a little bit about the diagnosis in the next question. But that point you brought up at the end about advocacy, parental advocacy. So much we know in gaining access through the education system for students depends on that really strong parental advocacy. And that is, as you said, something that not everyone is comfortable doing. And if there's a language barrier, certainly that makes it more difficult. Or if there are other issues of racism that are going on, parents might not get as far with that advocacy for sure. So those are really, that's a really good discussion of the barriers that are preventing students from gaining access to the instruction that they need. I'm just going to share my screen again, and we'll go on to the next discussion question, which really gets back to some things that both Cheryl and Risha were mentioning, which is the formal identification of students with learning disabilities. And actually, Amuna sort of mentioned this as well, that she was able to get an official learning disability diagnosis for her daughter, and then she was able to participate in that regional program, which has been so very successful for her. But those regional programs are often reserved for students who have a formal learning disability identification. So in Ontario, we have a policy called PPMH, which is the definition of learning disability in Ontario. And we define learning disability. It says the Ministry of Education defines learning disability as one of a number of neurodevelopmental disorders that persistently and significantly has an impact on the ability to learn and use academic and other skills, and then there's a whole list of exclusionary clauses. And this is one of them. It says, and that is not the result of socioeconomic factors, cultural differences, lack of proficiency in the language of instruction, lack of motivation, or effort. So I just want to bring it back to our panel guests and have them comment on this particular provincial policy. Do you see issues with this? Do you think that this is an equitable policy? And I'm going to ask Anthony to chime in on this one first.
Thank you. And again, this comes right down to the core of why things can't happen in schools and why these challenges become exasperated from the ministry down to the student. In my opinion, the ministry does not have the courage to even admit that dyslexia exists. It is very hard, even with a psychoeducational assessment, to see dyslexia written in the actual report. So why is that? And I suspect if the ministry were to open itself up to allowing this type of specific challenge to be laid, they'd be seen in a malpractice suit. And that's the problem. They do not want to admit that there is currently malpractice going on in their school systems. So what happens is parents have to work really hard to convince the school that their child needs to be tested. And as was mentioned earlier, these tests don't happen until as late as grade 3. Well, this is a real problem. And what happens for marginalized kids, and I'll use my own son as an example, when he knows right away with his peers, when he hears his peers reading and he hears himself reading, he's noting differences in grade 1 and in grade 2. And what do kids do? They are resilient and they are adaptive. They then take on behaviors and strategies that protect themselves, but appear as being behavioral within the class. They avoid doing the things that they know they are not as capable as the peers that they're listening to in their class. And these two things get misconstrued. Kids then get labeled as behavioral instead of looking at what the root cause of the challenges are. I know with my own son, I've been very mindful, as my wife, and we've been very mindful of watching his well-being at all times, because where the tragedy becomes even more exasperated for children, if they are not diagnosed, if parents are not fully aware why these learning gaps are in place, the older the child becomes, the more disenfranchised they become. And the more they want to hide or retreat or whatever their coping mechanism, they kick that into high gear to mask the challenges that are underlying their inability to read effectively. And then they get diagnosed with the wrong, they get diagnosed with what they're expressing instead of what is at the cause of their frustration. So when you see that definition that you had flashed up there, and they talk about lack of motivation or effort, this is wholly unfair And it's a way of the ministry shielding itself, hiding itself, because they don't want to admit to the malpractice that is going on systemically in all schools, in all classrooms, where teachers are not trained properly.
That is such a good point. Yeah, there's a lot of really good points that you made there for sure. And one of the pieces that you talked about is the impact on students when those diagnoses are delayed or never happen at all. They don't get the correct diagnosis. That was one of the things that we looked at in that report that we put out in the fall, lifting the curtain on EQAO scores. And we were expecting that there weren't going to be a lot of kids that had that formal diagnosis in grade 3, because we sort of knew that it usually kind of happens after that grade 3 EQAO test. But we were expecting that a lot more of them would have been identified by grade 6. But what we found was it was less than 1% of students in the province have an LD diagnosis in grade 3, but when they write the EQAO. It only goes up to about, I think it was 3% in grade 6. It doesn't go up much. It's not until high school. By the time that students are in grade 10, we're at like 8.5%, 9%. So it just speaks to how late we're leaving that identification process. And that really does have a tremendous impact. I know lots of parents who said that they've, been taking their child to a psychologist for treatment of anxiety or depression. And then that's when they discover that really the child has an underlying learning disability that's never been identified. And I want to jump to Amuna and let you chime in on this one, because I know that this is an experience that you've gone through yourself. And so if you spoke to it a bit before, but I'll let you jump back in.
Yeah, I don't even know if there's much more to add in terms of what Anthony has shared. And I know the rage that you feel around this definition as well. My child is in school in the Peel District School Board. They've just recently started to collect race-based statistics with regards to the experiences of students. Once that happened, they had a lot of evidence that they were no longer able to turn a blind eye to. So things that the parents knew, things that the parents were experiencing, things that the students were living on a regular basis. Once they had the data, they were no longer able to turn a blind eye to the outcomes for the students. And so when you have a definition that just crosses off a bunch of factors that we all know contribute to the situation that our children are finding themselves in, it just compounds the issues. And I can go on about her experiences, but we know that once things are acknowledged, they have to be addressed. And our story really was that point of, I thought support was happening, and then in grade 8 I realized, oh my goodness, this isn't happening, and then just had to set the school on fire to be able to get the support that my child needed. And I think a lot of it really has to do with that. They talked about her being sleepy in class, right? Which is what Anthony's talking about. So instead of engaging with the material, she would start to yawn, and the teachers would say, oh, she's tired. She's getting enough sleep at night. She's not participating. She doesn't really seem interested, when all of these other things were happening for her, but no one took the time to look at that. There are a bunch of reasons why that is the case. And that sort of definition allows all of those things not to be surfaced.
Yeah, that is so true. It's an easy out, right? It's really an easy out, not our problem. It's, something else for sure. And one point you raised that I think is so important is the lack of race-based data in education in Ontario. It is really hard to find that information. Well, I've got some that I'm going to show in a minute from the Toronto District School Board, but most school boards in Ontario simply don't collect that. And we haven't really been able to analyze that. The only thing that the province does track is language status. So we do have statistics on the under identification of students who are classified as English language learners. We know that like less than 1% of students who are classified as English language learners in the province receive an official LD diagnosis, compared to like 9% of students who are not. So that's obviously a very problematic. And Risha, I want to invite you, if you had any further comments on sort of that formal identification process for students with dyslexia or learning disabilities.
Yes, so the U.S. Education Law IDEA is similar in that it talks about socioeconomic status and cultural differences. We don't have the language around motivation, which is just horrific. But what I will say, although we don't have the language in our policy around motivation, we have the results of it. So we have the blame game happening here as well. And it's a big part of it where you blame the family. So, oh, how many books do you have in the home? Or where did your child go to preschool? Or, if there's something that seems, not typical in a home, maybe it's well, what's your parent's educational level? Or, if a parent is working and can't come to a parent-teacher conference, all of those types of things end up just placing the blame back on the family and back on the students. And this idea of motivation is something that we hear a lot too, as well. So, oh, they're not trying hard enough. And in fact, students with dyslexia are trying so much harder than you can see. A lot of that work that's happening is internal. And so the pain is internal, right? So you don't see how much harder they're trying, and then you don't see the impact until it turns into a behavior. And so, like I said, although we don't have the language, we see and we feel that same thing happening here in the States. And I was horrified to actually see that in print in your policies. It's unbelievable. And it removes the onus from the decision makers to actually just teach children to read, right? Provide all children with structured literacy, begin as soon as they enter school, kindergarten, and then we don't have to have these issues. And that's a larger question as to why we continue not to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is such a good point. Like, let's just teach the kids to read. Like, do we really need to worry about those external factors? Let's just get down to business and get it done. I like that very much. And Cheryl, I want to give you a chance to jump in and comment on this one.
There's so many wonderful things said by everyone else. I guess the more I was thinking about this, the more I kind of related it to my own personal family example, that if we kind of go through this list, almost everything in this list precludes my daughter from getting a diagnosis of a learning disability. She has cultural differences. She grew up in a multilingual household. So you could, she lacked proficiency. Her other language was Arabic, which has an opposite directionality than English. So there's an easy explanation for why she might have had reversals in handwriting or reading or whatnot. When you can't read and you're in the grade 5 classroom and your group is giving you the art project to do all the time in the group projects, then yeah, you're not motivated or have any effort because you cannot read in grade 5. So it's just so saddening to me that that's there, and I'm just sad. That's all. And I hope many families don't have to suffer the effects of the consequence of that clause in that definition.
Thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, I have to say the first time that I read that policy, I was saddened isn't quite the word. I was enraged. I will say I couldn't believe that is in a provincial policy in Ontario, in a place where we pride ourselves on multiculturalism and progressive values, that we would actually have that written into a provincial policy. I think that's disgraceful. So I just want to share the screen again and go back to the presentation. So I wanted to now just kind of go through and unpack, what are the results of our current pedagogy? So how are we actually doing with reaching that goal of 75% of children reading? How is it going for us? So as I shared on an earlier slide, about 30% of kids learn to read easily. For about 70%, the outcomes depend on access to instruction. I did see in the chat that some people were asking for references for this, and there's a few different sources for sure. It's referenced in the article by Louisa Moats, Teaching Reading is Rocket Science. Nancy Young also has her own graphic for this, which is fantastic, the reading ladder. And she has a list of references that go along with that as well. So as we said, 30% of students learn to read quite easily, like many of our panel guests did, with very broad instructions. So you would sort of expect that about 30% of kids would be excelling with reading and literacy in Ontario. But according to our EQAO results, the most recent year, which was 2019, it's been canceled because of COVID, of course, only 17% of children are actually excelling, like getting above the provincial standard on that test. 49% of kids are meeting the basic provincial standard. And we have fully a third of students who are not receiving the instruction that they need to be successful at reaching the provincial standard for literacy. But when we look at that third, again, this is province-wide, about 33% of students. And this, if you're looking for more information on this, you can find that in our fall report, Lifting the Curtain on EQAO scores. We break that down in great detail. I wanted to also look at this, look at some disaggregated data around this, because we know that the 30% is not representative of the entire population. But as we mentioned, there's issues with data reporting and collection. So I don't have province-wide data for this. I only have Toronto District School Board data. So in the Toronto District School Board, we know that 15% of students who come from families that are in the highest income bracket, which I believe is over $150,000 a year, 15% of those students are not meeting the provincial standard. And there are 43% of students who are in the lowest income bracket in the Toronto District School Board who did not meet the grade 3 EQAO standard. When we look at race-based data, they have some, but again, not as much as I would like. 24% of white students in the Toronto District School Board did not meet the grade 3 EQAO standard. And 49% of Black students did not meet the grade 3 EQAO standard with the instruction that they are receiving in the Toronto District School Board. And I would like to say that I also did look for information and statistics for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children, but the Toronto District School Board doesn't actually provide that information. They don't have it. So we know that the outcomes for reading are deeply inequitable, but there has been a general notion for a very long time that this is just a fact of life, something that we just kind of need to accept. It's kind of a resigned acceptance. As noted in this quote, which is from a former education minister from Ontario, who is quoted as saying, "Income-based differences in school test results have been a fact of life for a very long time." We just sort of need to accept that this is just the way it is. So my guest, or my question for the panel guests are, should we accept inequitable outcomes as an inevitability? And I'm gonna, again, start with Anthony. Should we accept it?
We can never accept the type of disparity that we're seeing when the system isn't addressing the core needs of these kids to begin with. I would, if we could say that all teachers were given the tools, the training, and the time to teach language instruction properly, I'd love to see what that data would look like and then address any further inequities. I'm not an expert in determining from the numbers how that might change. I do know that virtually none of the teachers are given the tools that they need. And And so the data is going to be filled with inequity. So I would be one of those, my child did meet the grade 3 expectations, but was he advantaged? Absolutely, because I'm spending a fortune. I might have the knowledge myself, but I can't teach my own child. So I'm spending a fortune for an intervention, for multiple interventions for my son that other people can't access. And that's not fair. But at the same time, every parent is going to do whatever they can to try to support their child. So I come right back to this. When we look at these inequitable outcomes, if the province doesn't universally change the way that we're teaching reading, then we're going to have disparities that will be fraught with opportunities for disproportionate outcomes. If, for example, we think that if, for example, if the government falls into the trap that believing programs offered by Sick Kids Hospital, as an example, the Empower program, is the panacea to this problem, it will create new inequitable challenges that cannot be overcome. We must first universally have all teachers teaching systematic, explicit instructions on how to read, collect that data, and see where our problems lie thereafter before I can make an anecdotal response. But if we think there's some other third party or some other mystical power that's going to come in and change the outcome for these kids, we are just creating more inequity.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, from a system perspective, I can't give you a better response, but all teachers need these tools and we need it now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We can't imagine that we're going to solve this issue by simply sprinkling on more new programs for after the kids have failed and they're in grade 4, 5, 6, 7. We really need to look at this as a general classroom instruction issue. And the solution, as you said, I 100% agree with you. It's teacher training, teacher knowledge, and making sure that they have the resources and the time that they need to meet the needs of all the kids. And there are some examples of places in the States, and actually I'm going to go with Kamisha next, but maybe when we get to Risha, maybe she can talk about some of the places where they have actually started to put those things in place, or if anybody else wants to bring those up. Kamisha, yeah, if you wanted to weigh in and talk about, should we accept this inequity?
Absolutely not. Not when the evidence supports the fact that 95% of people can learn to read. You know, there was an article in the Globe and Mail in 2020 written by Julia O'Sullivan, a former dean at U of T's Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. And the article she shares, in that article, she shares that in 2020, 400,000 5-year-olds were enrolled in kindergarten classes across the country. And it was projected that by the time they finished grade 3, 100,000, so 25%, would be unable to read and write well enough to keep up in grade 4. And that was before the pandemic. And we know that Black and Indigenous children are overrepresented in the number of children who will struggle to catch up. And studies show us that most never will. And, you know, I think about the fact that we're still in the midst of this like storm of a pandemic, and we're still unclear of what the impact to students' learning and their mental health and well-being will be. But we know it's been devastating. And I'd say that, you know, at the Reading Partnership, we've been laser focused on addressing the issue of low literacy in the Kingston, Galloway, Orton Park community. We're right now approximately 39% of grade 3 children are not meeting the provincial standards for reading. And in some schools, it's as high as 60%. And this is also, I should mention, a 25-year trend in this community. So how many students coming or living in the Kingston, Galloway, Orton Park community has the system failed? And, so enough is enough. This is like, it's shameful. And it's really time for our government and for our school boards to take responsibility for this mess. And hopefully through the work of the Ontario Human Rights Commission on the right to read inquiry, like, we'll have the grounds to actually hold them accountable. And I think that's one of the biggest issues, is that who do we hold accountable? Like, we can present these numbers, but at the end of the day, who do we hold accountable?
Yeah, that is such a good point. And I totally agree with you. Enough is enough. It's time that we hold someone accountable, because it's unacceptable. Absolutely. Amuna, would you like to give us your thoughts?
Yes, so I'm going to echo in on the no. Surprised that we shouldn't accept this inequity. I think really it's just, there are a lot of things that we won't be able to solve. There are a lot of inequities that it's going to take a really long time, and maybe we haven't come up with some of those solutions. I don't think this is one. I think that there's a lot of work out there. There's a lot of evidence out there that this is something that we can solve, that resources need and can be put into finding a solution and helping children to read. So that there's really no reason that I can think of, no justifiable reason for not investing in this solution. And when you look at the end state, what is the result of not addressing this? We can see that when we think about mental health, when we think about the justice system, when we think about, the workforce, when we think about the perception that people have of their neighbors, their classmates, their colleagues, their friends, what happens within families, because we think about dyslexia and how that travels through families. This is one of the things that we have a solution for. And so this isn't an inequity, and not that we should accept any inequity, but this is one that can be tackled. And so it's just about the advocacy that's happening. Hopefully Right to Read will be that mechanism that will help to put some accountability on the system and help parents to understand that this isn't about a deficiency within them or a deficiency with in terms of their children. There's something that we can do as a system to remedy this issue.
I think that is such an important point. There are a lot of things that we can't fix, but this is one of the things that we absolutely can fix. And yes, it's not on the parents, it's not on the children, it's on the system itself that needs to change. Thank you for that. And Risha, I'd love to have you jump in here. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, I know that there are stories of districts in the States that have really managed to turn things around. If you wanted to speak to any of those, again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but again.
Yeah, so I want to answer the question, and then I'll end it with an example of success in the States. And so, of course, like everyone else, my answer is no. My organization exists because the answer is no. But this is, when I think about literacy, it's one, and I'll say it's just one of sort of the civil rights. You can call it a human right or a social justice issue of our time. And so I think it was Amuna that said there's no justifiable reason why we can't make a change. But if we look at our history, there were a lot of forced inequities with no justifiable reason why they should exist, right? Segregation of schools, segregation of restaurants. There was no reasonable, no justifiable reason for that, yet they existed. And so I would equate it with some of those civil rights issues that we have seen across some of our lifetimes or our parents' lifetimes. And so we need the force of our ancestors, our civil rights leaders of our previous generation to demand change. And if we know that 95% of our children can be taught to read, then why would we accept anything less, right? Unless the goal is the inequity, right? So that is the question. And that's why I'm sort of framing it as this fight, because it is quite possible that the goal is to maintain inequity, right? So this isn't new. You know, I'm in the States, so I'm often going to refer to the history here, but you know, Frederick Douglass, hundreds of years ago, said, once you learn to read, you will forever be free, right? Hundreds of years ago, he understood that access to literacy is freedom, yet we continue to deny it to so many people. And we see the disparities across race and class. So we have to continue to fight for it, but we also have to understand that there may be some deliberate things happening here that are maintaining this system that we see. And the example is actually Mississippi. And so I don't have all of the numbers in front of me, but you can certainly Google it. There's a lot of information about the gains that they've made, and they implemented letters training, I believe it was, for I think more than 15,000 teachers. And they were the one state, I believe, that had gains on the NAEP, which looks at our measures of reading proficiency. And I think they looked at 4th grade. You know, I say definitely Google it, look at the demographics of Mississippi. And if they can do it, it can be done anywhere. It's a choice.
Absolutely. I think that is so important to point out that, yes, it's a choice that we're making to continue doing things the way that we are doing them, for sure. And that example of Mississippi is a great example. There's also an example I can just point to quickly here in Canada. In Edmonton, Alberta, they did a project in a number of schools. I think it was like 7 or 8 schools in Edmonton, where they implemented structured literacy, screening, and early intervention starting in kindergarten. And by the end of grade 2, they had less than 3% of kids that were not reading at benchmark. So that was in Canada. That was in 2017. They followed those kids until they were at in grade 3, and they had fantastic results. So it absolutely can be done. And Cheryl, I just want to have you jump in here. So should we accept the inequity?
Yeah, no, of course not. Yeah. So, you know, sometimes I feel like we live in this romantic notion that school is like a great equalizer. You know, everyone from all walks of life show up at our public schools, our public institutions of learning, and it will create that level playing field for everyone, and it'll be great. But it, you know, one thing I put in my notes for this session is it's not the great equalizer, it's the great perpetuator. So as the system is and as things are, the school perpetuates that, and the inequities exist, and it's really so harmful. And one thing I'd just like to add to this conversation is, and thinking about equity, and you know, in Ontario we're thinking about de-streaming, and it's starting in high school and in grade 9, which is great, but I really feel we need a great focus on de-streaming in terms of reading and how that plays out in leveled groups. And a lot of inequity starts right there at the very beginning.
Yes, absolutely. And I know we're getting very close to our time, so I just want to quickly talk about the OHRC inquiry and what we're expecting. So as I'm sure most people here know, in 2019, the Ontario Human Rights Commission launched a full public inquiry to look into these issues of systemic inequity in Ontario's education system in relation to how we are teaching reading. So the OHRC inquiry is looking at, they've created a set of benchmarks. They are looking at teacher training. They are looking at the way that we're teaching children in the general classroom, starting in kindergarten. They're looking at how we're assessing children and what sort of interventions are being offered. We're expecting that the findings of the inquiry will be coming out in February at some point soon, and I know I am very excited about this. And I just wanted to end the panel discussion tonight and invite our guests to end on a positive note and share with us their hopes for what will be coming down the line in the future after the inquiry is out. What are you hoping that we will achieve here in Ontario? And I will start again with you, Anthony, for just our last. We've only got very few minutes left, so quick little answers.
So again, I'll share sort of a systemic response. I'm hoping this report has been delayed several times in its release, and so that is a source of frustration. I'm hoping with the coming provincial election that someone will, a party, at least one party, will seize the report and say, I'm going to build my education platform on what I'm hopeful is going to be a systemic change in approach to teaching reading. And if that is true, and this will affect all schools, all students, all teachers, if that's the approach that's taken, the one area of focus that school boards will really have to think about is how to implement change system-wide in a manner that brings everybody into the tent and moves away from shame and blame. Because we cannot afford to stumble if the types of reforms that we're praying for come to fruition. We are talking about reculturing school systems, not implementing a simple change, reculturing schools to focus on reading and writing. And this requires highly skilled leaders, from the director of education to the superintendents, the principals, the teachers, bringing unions together, parents together, students together to understand the mistakes that were systemic, not the function of, not the fault of any one particular group other than the ministry, and working together to say, we can do better. We need to build confidence in one another. We're going to make some mistakes along the way, but we have to build that trust and confidence to move everyone and elevate everyone in a systematic way. So I'm hopeful this will become an election issue.
Thank you. I think that's such an important point, that it can't end up being a blame and shame game. Because then people will not have that opportunity for growth. And it is a really large systemic change, as you say. So we need to bring everybody along in that change instead of pushing people away or polarizing people in any way. So that's such a great point. Kamisha, what are you hoping to see coming down the pipe after the Right to Read inquiry comes out?
For sure, my answer to this is going to be really brief. I would say clear recommendations that provide a pathway for governments, for school board organizations and families to move forward. I would say also the ability to hold government and school boards accountable. And lastly, framework for effective reading intervention that really ensures that children get the support that they need to succeed.
Thank you. Yeah, all good, important points for sure. That accountability piece, and also that like a standard and consistent framework would be really nice, so that parents could navigate that and it would be the same experience for students regardless of their postal code, for sure. Amuna, I want to give you a chance to jump in here.
It's the accountability piece for me. I think establishing this as a human right is something that needs to happen, that all children have the right to read, and that if our education system does not equip themselves so that this can happen for children, will have the opportunity to take school systems to court. I spent 10 years working at legal aid, and I can see how practices, policies, laws get changed as a result of people bringing actions forward. So I think if this is done correctly, we may have an opportunity as parents, as citizens, as advocacy groups to say you're falling short, you're not meeting the human rights of the most vulnerable, and force systems to be held accountable in that way.
That is a great point. I hope to see all of those things as well. And Risha, I want to ask you to jump in here. I know that you're not here in Ontario, so I don't expect that you've been necessarily following our human rights inquiry. But what sort of things do you think would be great to see in sort of systemic government policies in general around teaching children to read?
I'm just going to quickly echo some of what I heard because it was so well said. I really like the idea of reculturing school systems. That is important and that needs to happen for anything to be sustainable. The idea of having accountability, a consistent framework, and what Amuna said, because I think this is really important. It is a human rights issue, right? And when we frame it like that, we can start to have a different impact. We really focus on how important this is, how fundamental this is to having access to life, right? Because for many, it's a life or death issue. And when I initially was faced with a dyslexia diagnosis for my son, that's what it felt like for me as a Black woman who grew up in New York City and having seen so many people failed by our systems, that this is an issue of life or death. If you can read or not, it can impact you in so many ways. And so framing it as that, I think, would be really powerful.
Thank you. And Cheryl, I guess the last word goes to you. What are you hoping to see come out of the OHRC Right to Read inquiry?
I'll focus on two things. I think the first one is being seen. And that might sound like a strange thing to say, but people who use the term dyslexia, people who look like me, people who struggle with reading aren't really often just seen for having this concern, if you will. So somehow just that recognition of being seen, I think, is so critical. The other point I would talk about is the accountability piece in terms of a curriculum with clear, explicit statements about what children should know, let's say beginning of grade 1, middle of grade 1, end of grade 1, beginning of grade 2, middle, and so forth and so on. That's really clear and would be really supportive to everyone in the system in terms of teaching structured literacy to ensure literacy as a human right, which it really is. We cannot function in our knowledge society in the way it's configured nowadays for people without literacy that equips people to engage in discourse, to be part of society productively. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I just want to remind everyone that the OHRC inquiry findings are expected to come out in February, and that it's very important that all of us that are committed to this issue, committed to seeing reading as a human right and fighting for the rights of all children to learn to read, that we really rally behind that report and do everything that we can to make sure that it does become an issue and that the government does act upon the recommendations, because there is no guarantee. It is a report with recommendations, but it is incumbent upon the government to actually enact legislation or change teacher training, change the curriculum to actually implement those recommendations. So I'm appealing to everyone who's here tonight to please follow the Ontario Human Rights Commission on social media, Facebook and Twitter. If you stay tuned to IDA Ontario, we will be sending out updates as they become available. And really, please mobilize your communities and your networks. your personal network in your school to just share the information so that when that report comes out, that as many people as possible are aware of what's in that report and what the OHSC is calling for our kids and for our communities. So again, I want to thank all of our panel guests for joining us tonight. I know you are all busy people, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join in on this conversation. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. And I see that it's been a very lively chat. I look forward to reading through all of that after we're done here. So again, thank you everyone, and good night. And I hope that we will see you at future IDA Ontario webinars. So thanks for joining us, everyone.